I feel like this rare earth saga will be a bit of a line in the sand. Like we have these periodically in the EU-China relationship where something happens and it's something that very much changes the thinking.
The European Union's trade deficit with China has doubled over the past decade, fueling growing frustration in Brussels over what officials describe as a flood of low-cost Chinese products into the EU. Beijing's continued support for Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine is also a major sticking point. The EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, called China the key enabler of Putin's war and urged Beijing to halt its support to Russia's military-industrial base. In response, China has indicated that it does not want to see Russia lose the war. It was not surprising then that a summit in Beijing between top EU and Chinese leaders at the end of July produced few tangible results. Just ahead of the summit, I spoke with Finbarr Bermingham, Europe correspondent for the South China Morning Post, to explore what's really driving the tensions in EU-China trade. We discussed the growing trade imbalance and how China's rare earth export controls and unwavering support for Russia are reshaping the relationship. Hello and welcome to Perspectives with Nilo. I'm your host, Neil O'Sullivan. If you are new to the podcast, we've got over 70 past episodes waiting for you, and you can explore all of them on our blog at pwnilo.com or by searching for Perspectives with Nilo wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate a like, follow or subscribe if you enjoy our content. This is the best way to support us, and thanks in advance for your support. At the end of July, European Union leaders met with Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping, in Beijing at a summit that was billed as celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations between the two economies. However, both sides struck a somber tone amid growing pessimism about the relationship, with host China actually shortening the summit meeting from 2 days to 1. It's important to remember that EU-China summits have been relatively contentious affairs since 2021, delivering no agreements of substance. In fact, the last time such a summit produced a comprehensive joint statement was in 2019. However, many analysts had speculated that Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs might drive the EU and China closer together. So, what happened? This was the first question I put to my guest, Finbarr Bermingham, who is Europe correspondent for the South China Morning Post. I met up with him at the McGill Summer School in Glenties, County Donegal, on July 18th. So Finbarr, in the past few months, we've seen the Trump tariffs, the Trump Liberation Day, and all the uncertainty that's come from that. There was a lot of speculation that this uncertainty between EU and US relations would maybe drive the EU and China closer together. So how have we seen the China-EU relationship progress since Liberation Day?
I think it's probably regressed. I think it's probably gotten worse. And I think there was a lot of speculation, and I think people were looking back to 2017 when Donald Trump first came into power. He won the election in 2016, and afterwards the EU and China did grow closer together. There was this famous Davos speech by Xi Jinping when he talked about being the sort of guardian of the multilateral order and so on. And at that time that was sort of music to the Europeans' ears because they were getting bashed by Trump and they weren't quite so cynical on China as they were. So I think for those who maybe don't necessarily watch the bilateral relationship that closely, there was almost like a sense that, okay, this is going to happen again. There's been a lot of water under the bridge since 2017. The EU relationship with China has gotten steadily worse. You had the pandemic, and then after that you had sort of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and those are the two major sort of elements which I think have served to change the view in Europe, the popular view in Europe towards China. There's also been sort of several quite maybe lower level issues such as the coercion of Lithuania and so on, but they've all amounted to a great degree of cynicism towards China in Brussels. And so I always thought it was a little bit reductive to think that if you pull two parts of the triangle apart, then the other two would just get closer together. It didn't really make sense, and it has emerged that was right. It hasn't happened. The trade issues have become more of an issue, like more of a problem. China's dominance of certain clean tech and high tech sectors is a worry for the Europeans. And so what we've seen over the last 6 months of Trump is that actually there's possibly a little bit more antagonism in the relationship. At the start, there was some noises out of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the President, and so on, making clear that they were open to improving their trade and investment relationship with China. And I think that was a message that was going out in 3 different directions. It was going to Beijing, come and make us an offer. It was going to Trump, look, we've got other options. But it was also around the time of the German election, so it was going to her conservative base in Germany to say, look, I'm not a radical hawk. You don't need to be worried about me. I'm pragmatic. And at that stage, February time, everybody was putting out these sort of messages of pragmatism because everybody was worried about the ruptures that Trump was causing. But all to say that things haven't been repaired. A lot of these things are irreparable. The trade issues are getting worse and worse. There's real concern now with Trump's really high trade tariffs that Chinese goods will come to Europe at a cut price and imperil local companies.
Flood the market.
Exactly. There's also, the situation with Russia has not necessarily improved. China is, still seen to be economically and diplomatically supporting Russia. So it was always a bit far-fetched, and what we've seen is steadily it's getting worse and worse.
And you mentioned Xi Jinping's statement there about multilateralism, and it seemed like during the recent visit of Wang Yi to meet with EU officials like Kaja Kallas a couple of weeks back, he was still parroting some of the same stuff. He was saying, China and EU should join forces against unilateralism and bullying, making it sound like China never bullies anyone and, is a stalwart of multilateral relations. I mean, they're not changing their message, it seems.
No, China's message has never really changed. I was at the Munich Security Conference in February. This was where J.D. Vance came and did his first big Europe speech, and everybody was shocked. He was going all out on Europe for woke culture and migrant friendly policies, which I don't see too many of in Europe. But it was a real sort of dressing down of Europe. And right after him, or shortly after him, Wang Yi gave a speech, and he said all of those things that you just said. There was nothing new. They didn't repackage it in a substantial way. Just that we need to uphold the multilateral order together, and so on. So there hasn't been really much effort from China to deliver too much apart from platitudes.
Yeah, even though Kaja Kallas keeps talking about China's distortive trade practices, and we know about the EVs, right, and the vast quantity that China are producing and their ability to flood the market. But of course, the EU introduced tariffs on those. What are the other kind of things that listeners mightn't be aware of that China are doing to create this distortive type of market or relationship that they mentioned?
I think some of it's quite old. It won't be too surprising to anybody who's followed it. There's sort of the opacity of the subsidy regime. So the state subsidies that are not declared. Everybody subsidizes their companies, but per WTO rules, there are ways in which you're supposed to declare it. And there's a sense that China is not being transparent with this. There's the level playing field. European companies in China do not have the same access to the market that companies from China in Europe do. So it's very imbalanced. I think what's changed in the last few years is that where China was seen as sort of the workshop of the world, and it was seen as a sort of a place where you could get cheap stuff. We've seen in the last few years that China, companies in China, industry in China has really, really developed very quickly, very successfully, let's say. And the companies that were once selling parts or they were either suppliers to, for example, big German machinery companies, or they were buyers, for their factories. They're now competitors, and they're competing at a really cutthroat pricing levels. And so there's a fear in Europe, and they're making so much, they're overproducing, and so there's a problem with overcapacity, industrial overcapacity in the Chinese economy. So in a way, it's a sort of victim of its own success. They're so good at making a lot of these high-tech goods, like batteries. Nobody can really rival the Chinese for making these lithium-ion batteries. They're just making so much of some of these products, and then they go out to the world at a cheaper price, flooding, dumping, or whatever way you want to call it. But the Europeans are very worried about this because the complementarity in the economic relationship seems to be disappearing. What was once very much a symbiosis, particularly between Germany and China, is now really, really tough competition.
And recently I saw you wrote in one of your columns in relation to rare earths that, a fresh dark cloud, you called it a fresh dark cloud over the relationship. I guess you're referring to these export controls that China are placing on rare earths. Yeah. Why is that important for the EU?
Well, it's important to anybody who wants to make anything modern, anything that's high-tech, any of the goods that we use, our phones, the microphone that you have. I'm sure that there's some sort of a rare earth element somewhere in the process of making this. And China has become dominant in this. China doesn't have all of these rare earths. I mean, it doesn't mine all of them in China, but it processes almost everything in China. So they have been very successful at scouting the world and finding where these things are in the ground, getting them out of the ground and processing them in China, which is a filthy, toxic, polluting process. And they don't have to worry about NIMBYism so much in China. They can, there are districts or parts of the north of China where they do a lot of this processing, where the cancer rates are really high, and it's linked to the processing of these rare earths. So I think for a long time we in the West were very happy to outsource this because we didn't want to be doing this. Yeah. But now it's gotten to the stage where we're so dependent on China. And these are so vital to building the sort of products that will power the economic future. And so earlier this year, in retaliation to some of Trump's trade measures against Beijing, they overnight introduced export restrictions, which meant you would have to get a license to export these to a West or to a foreign company. So it meant that the whole process was gummed up. It took months and months for these licenses to be approved. The Chinese said, well, we're short-staffed. This was quite sudden. MOFCOM is sort of spread very thinly. I mean, obviously they could have predicted this, but and what was supposed to be a measure that was intended to punish the United States ended up catching Europe in the crossfire. And there's a debate about whether it was intentional or whether it was accident or design. And with China, I usually think it's somewhere in the middle. Probably it was intended at the United States, but when it caught Europe as well, it was, well, okay, why not? Let's show these Europeans who are really like speaking out against us, and they're being quite hard line. Why don't we just show them who's boss as well? So this is a real problem. It's revealed a choke point that we knew was there, but we didn't realize would be so readily weaponized. And so it's a big problem for Europe. And to go back to the very first question about the fact that the relationship hasn't gotten better. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's gotten worse. I feel like this rare earth saga will be a bit of a line in the sand. Like we have these periodically in the EU-China relationship where something happens, and it's something that very much changes the thinking. For example, in 2016. When a Chinese company called Medea bought a German robotics company called KUKA, that was what basically led to the inception of a foreign direct investment screening mechanism, because they were worried about Chinese companies buying up all of Europe's crown jewels. The coercion of Lithuania in 2021, 2022, after the opening of a Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius, led indirectly to the anti-coercion instrument, which was initially geared towards Donald Trump, but which was galvanized by Beijing's own actions. So I'm wondering where this is going to go with the rare earths. We're very much backed into a corner. Europe is in a very poor position. We don't have these rare earths, nor do we want to process them here. Yeah. And so I don't know where it's going to go, but I know that from my conversations with officials in Brussels, they feel like this is a real moment of learning. They've learned a lot about China because of this episode, how they work and what they're willing to do, and it's a show of force.
And the other thing that I guess that's important for Europe is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This also came up at the Kaja Kallas Wang Yi meeting, and Kallas is quoted as saying, the serious threat Chinese companies' support for Russia's illegal war poses to EU security. This is a big concern for Europe. And I think you wrote about this as well yourself, and the position that has finally come to light, or it's almost, I don't know whether Wang Yi admitted it, but it certainly has become more clear in terms of China's support for Russia. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there was so we've got the EU-China summit next week, and as a preparatory meeting for that, there was this what's called strategic dialogue in the sort of the legalese language of Brussels. And this was Wang Yi, the foreign minister, came to meet Kaja Kallas, his European Union counterpart. And, Kallas is Estonian former prime minister. She has a reputation for being a Russia hawk. She's look, a lot of people in Brussels would say she's got a one-track mind. She only ever thinks about Russia. So every other issue is secondary to this. And so obviously when she sits down with the Chinese foreign minister, you can kind of expect what's going to happen. So my sense from various discussions with people who were there was that Kallas kept prodding him on this, and he didn't take too kindly to being told by someone who he considers to be very much his junior. This is a very polished, very veteran diplomat in Wang Yi, known to be a very smooth operator, whereas Kallas is sort of a new kid on the block. She's never done foreign policy, and I think Wang Yi felt this very acutely, and so he attempted to give her a lecture in realpolitik. Let me tell you how the world really works. And it slipped out at that point, and he said, well, we do not want Russia to lose, because if Russia loses, then America will turn its attention fully towards Asia and towards China, so they will be in our backyard. This was the first time that the folks that I know in Brussels and the EU had heard this being said out loud. Yeah. It was said to me that this was like saying the quiet bit out loud, because of course most of the people working in the EU suspected that this is what China thought all along. A frozen conflict maybe suits Beijing's strategic objectives better than any sort of resolution.
Yeah. Which is kind of, it points to a certain amount of Chinese hypocrisy, because a year or so ago they came out with a 12-point peace plan for the Ukraine-Russian war. But it seems they're not serious at all. This is not something they want. I mean, we see Chinese troops in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have arrested Chinese troops. Whether they've been sent there officially or not, of course, is hard to determine. And we also see, of course, North Korean troops fighting now on Russia's side. And some commentators will say that, North Korea would not send troops to Russia if they didn't have the okay from the CCP. So it kind of points to quite a lot of involvement. I mean, am I reading too much into that?
I think there's several things. I wouldn't say Chinese troops. There have been some soldiers from China.
Sorry. Yeah, I stand corrected.
The sense I get is these are probably mercenaries. They're probably not on an official mission. I don't know. I mean, that's just my guess. I mean, I think, another thing that Wang Yi said in the meeting with Kaja Kallas was, look, we're not material. We are, obviously they have an economic relationship with Russia. Obviously we know that they're providing a lot of dual-use goods. They don't recognize Western sanctions and so on. But the one thing Wang Yi says is, look, if we really were supporting Russia militarily, this war would have ended a long time ago. I think that's probably right. That's not to say they're not helping at the margins. I don't know about the North Korea thing. I hear that all the time. I'm really not. That's not my wheelhouse. I don't know. I mean, you hear all sorts of stuff about, what is or isn't the relationship between Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un and stuff. I really don't know. But yeah, I mean, the sense is that what they will tell us in the EU is that 80% of the dual-use goods that reach the battlefield from the Russian side come through China.
The session you chaired at the McGill Summer School earlier this week, a very enlightening session, but one of your panelists was Danako O'Bacoin. He said that he felt Russia couldn't prosecute this war against Ukraine without China's support. That's a fairly strong statement.
It is, but it could be read in several different ways. Okay, so it may not mean direct military help, but with the economic lifeline with which China is providing to Russia, I mean, what would happen if China stopped buying Russian oil? What would happen if, So the economic ties between Russia and China have become very tied up in the last few years. And there's been I think Donica also, I don't know if he used this term, but a sort of vassalization of Russia. It's become very dependent on China. So the partnership has flipped from the days of the Cold War, where Russia was seen as the senior partner and China was the junior partner. That has certainly flipped. And, China has... is the dominant partner in the relationship. Now, NATO uses language saying that China is a decisive enabler. You hear similar sorts of language out of the EU's Foreign Service, the External Action Service, about being a decisive enabler, and so I think it's probably fair to say that without sort of the financial, the economic lifeline that comes from China, Russia would no doubt find it very hard to do what it's doing.
You had a very interesting question to the panel after that discussion, which was, if Russia's, I guess, I don't know if Russia's victory is important to China, but if certainly keeping the war going, why don't they go further and, maybe enable Russia to win?
I think that there's several elements. I mean, if you think about what we were saying before, maybe a frozen conflict strategically is more suitable. So it's a sort of distraction for Europe, it's a distraction for America. And secondarily to that, I think probably more importantly, it would... I mean, if China really started materially sending proper military support to Russia, it would be really sanctioned very heavily. It would be subject to all sorts of international scrutiny that it would prefer to avoid. Its relationships with, it's already got tense ties with Europe, that would be absolutely down the tubes. I feel like even though I doubt how much leverage Europe has over China, I think China recognises that it needs Europe as an export market, and whereas I don't think China is willing to give too many concessions to Europe, I think that perhaps the relationship with Europe is also one of the reasons why it wouldn't go down that route. It would be strategically very stupid for China, and despite what you think of the leadership, I don't think they're stupid. They're smart. They think long term. I think sending really military support to Russia and sort of being that interventionary factor, I don't know that it would suit their long term goals.
There is a criticism, though, of the Europe-China relationship in that China can do a lot of things and Europe doesn't punch back, or that there's no fear within China of Europe punching back. And Europe recently announced their 18th package of sanctions on Russia, and it contains two Chinese banks
and quite a few Chinese small companies who are deemed to have broken the sanctions by funneling or facilitating the provision of goods that are banned from Europe reaching Russia's military.
Is this a punchback?
I don't think
so. Or is it just a tap on the chin?
I would probably say it's more of a tap on the chin. The Chinese hate it. They lobbied very heavily against it because I think, whereas they have added some companies to the list before, they haven't gone after Chinese banks. These are really small lenders based on the border with Russia. It's not like they're going after Bank of China or ICBC. So in that context, it's a symbolic move rather than being something that's going to really imperil the Chinese financial system. But look, it's part of an evolving picture. And on the point about punching back, I mean, I think this applies to the United States as much as it applies to China. I mean, it's really hard to get a common European position. Both these countries, China and America, are really big. They can move in a way that Europe can't. They act unilaterally and they act quickly. And they can really threaten each of the member states in a way that Europe, as a sort of like, however you, Commonwealth or whatever you want to call it, can't do.
Yeah. In terms of the rare earths, though, being a line in the sand, is it going to unite Europe more against China on these type of questions?
It's a good question. I mean, Europe is not united on anything. Not China, not America, not migration, not health policy, whatever it is. I mean, Europe is really at the moment ununited, disunited. What is the word? So I don't know. I mean, my sense in having been in Asia for a long time and come back to the EU, I'm always having to remind myself that it is essentially a reactive organization. It only moves when bad stuff happens. So it has to get really bad before they do anything. So if this rare earth situation got really bad and manufacturers in Hungary were having the same problems as manufacturers in Italy and Germany and here in Ireland or wherever, maybe then it would get some sort of a united response. But it's almost like I sort of sometimes use the analogy of like an alcoholic. It has to hit rock bottom before it starts rising up again. And I worry that Europe is too reactive. And we really have to wait for things to get very bad. I don't know about the rare earths. On this note, I really don't know what Europe can do. We're going to be reliant on China for these for, 5-10 years. They're going to have to make a fudge, find a way to make that work.
So they have a lot of leverage.
You don't just like overnight flip. There is nobody else who can sell you what you want.
Yeah.
You don't all of a sudden just find them in the ground here in Europe and start mining them and processing them. So it's a really long-term journey that they're on, and it will probably spawn lots of conversations about self-sufficiency and diversification and unwinding and unpicking and reducing dangerous dependencies. But look, we've been having these conversations. It's now 2025. COVID was 2020. I've been hearing this about de-risking and reducing dependencies, and for 5 years now, and it's very slow.
One of the things I think that was announced recently was that China lifted some restrictions on some European lawmakers. Reinhard Bütikofer, who was a retired German Green MEP, was one of those. I don't know if they lifted restrictions on Merix, who was the German think tank who they previously sanctioned. But do you think these things will do anything to warm the atmosphere for the upcoming summit, or will that take a lot more?
I think it takes a lot more. I feel like probably from the perspective of Beijing, they probably think like this is an important step. I mean, there's a lot of people in the foreign ministry who probably hate the idea of removing restrictions on Bütikofer. He has been a pain in the arse for them over the years. He's been instrumental in changing the position of the European Parliament. He's very influential in German politics. He's very in Brussels, super influential person, Mm-hmm. And so I think lifting those sanctions on him will not have come easily to the hawks in the foreign ministry. So for them, it's probably quite a big deal. But I think in the grand scheme of things, with everything else that's going on in Europe, it's not really going to move the needle. Perhaps they're looking for a little bit better mood music before the summit, but I think it's a drop in the ocean. I mean, it's the lowest of the lowest hanging fruit. Look, all of these things that China is being asked to do now are to remove the punishment. So it's not like the initial EU demands are almost like hidden behind all of these retaliatory measures. So the conversation has focused on remove your rare earth restrictions, which are punitive measures, remove the sanctions on lawmakers, which are retaliation for the EU's own sanctions, stop your brandy investigation, stop your dairy and pork investigation, all of which are retaliation against the electric vehicle probe. In Brussels, the trade officials there have an expression for this, and it's called the stinky fish. And they say that you put a stinky fish on my desk, and now you want me to pay you to take it away. So I think the idea that these are concessions is not really, it's not seen that way in Brussels. They're welcome, but they're not seen to be enough to move the needle. They're basically bringing you a bit closer to par, where you started, maybe before it all went down the tubes.
Okay. Well, Finbarr, it's been great chatting with you. We look forward to your reporting on the upcoming summit, and thank you again for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
That's Finbarr Bermingham, who is Europe correspondent for the South China Morning Post, speaking with me at the McGill Summer School in Glenties, County Donegal, earlier in July. My sincere thanks to Finbarr for sharing his valuable insights with us on Perspectives with Nilo. At the summit in Beijing on July 24th, both China and the EU stressed the importance of continued negotiations and dialogue. However, the talks failed to resolve differences over trade imbalances and Russia's war against Ukraine. The EU raised 3 trade concerns with China: better access for European firms to the Chinese market, overcapacity in some Chinese industrial sectors, and export controls on rare earths and related magnets. After the meeting, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that the EU-China trade relationship was at an inflection point and that the EU trade deficit with China had reached 300 billion euros. President von der Leyen also announced that the EU and China agreed on a new mechanism to help fast-track export licenses for rare earth elements and magnets. It has been reported that this agreement is tentative, so time will tell on how well it relieves the strain on European companies. On Ukraine, President von der Leyen said that how China continues to interact with Putin's war will be a determining factor for our own relations going forward. Chinese readouts from the summit largely echoed Beijing's ongoing efforts to position itself as a force for stability and an antidote to Trump's trade measures. You might like to check out our previous podcast entitled "A Straight Blockade is Not Stable Trade," in which we unpacked China's performance as a global trading partner. The only point of agreement from the meeting was a face-saving joint statement on climate, in which the two sides said they would enhance bilateral cooperation in such areas as energy transition, methane emissions management and control, carbon markets, and green and low-carbon technologies. They also affirmed their commitment to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. We've linked some recent articles on all of the topics discussed in this episode in the Dive Deeper section of our blog, which you can find at pwnilo.com. That's pwneilo.com. There you'll also find all of our past episodes and links to our social media pages, so be sure to check it out and like, follow and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. But that's where we leave it for now. As always, thank you for listening, and until the next time, Slán agus beannacht.